everybody. Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we explore the critical cybersecurity issues shaping today's geopolitical and business landscapes. We bring leaders together from cyber law, policy, or technology to offer insights that cut through the complexity of the digital age. I'm Cristin Flynn Goodwin, cybersecurity law and incident response expert. The epicenter of cybersecurity incident response for the past 25 years has always been the federal government. And right now, we're starting to see the ground shift with some major policy changes that will impact state and local cybersecurity leaders and companies alike. So in today's episode, we will unpack the new pivots towards state and local and work through what they mean in a major cyber event. With us to do that today is Doug Cavit, who's been involved in cybersecurity for 30 years as the CIO of McAfee and the chief security strategist at Microsoft, as well as the CISO for the startup Contain, working on automated cybersecurity in the cloud. Mr. Cavit was a major contributor to Microsoft entering the anti-malware marketplace and several versions of Windows. He has been involved in setting security standards for the financial services and utility industries, as well as the ISO process for secure software development. Doug has helped the global Fortune 1000 and governments around the world on security and is a noted speaker in the security industry. He also holds 4 patents for IT infrastructure. Currently, Doug is the CISO for Snohomish County in Washington State, which is one of the 75 largest counties in the country by GDP. He manages the cybersecurity for all law enforcement, courts, elections, major passenger airports, public works, and other essential county functions. I'm also happy to have Jeff Greene with us today. He's a distinguished fellow with the Aspen Institute's cybersecurity program and has worked in the national security and cybersecurity space for over 20 years. Most recently, he served as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at CISA, where he led the agency's cybersecurity division during discovery of and response to the PRC's recent intrusions into our major wireless providers. At the start of the Biden administration, he served as the chief for the cyber response and policy on the National Security Council in the White House. Previously, Jeff worked as the director of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST, was the vice president of global government affairs and policy at Symantec, and served on the Senate and the House Homeland Security committees. He's also served on several cybersecurity boards and commissions, including the Cyber Safety Review Board, NIST's Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board, shout out for NIST for ISPAB there, and is staff to President Obama's 2016 Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. So boy, do we bring the experts today. As always, the comments you hear today may reflect legal opinions, but do not constitute legal advice. I love to start these discussions with a little bit of history. And since Presidential Decision Directive 63 back in May of 98, we started down this path of critical infrastructure protection, the public-private partnership, and information sharing. And since that point, the industry's focal point for that partnership has been the federal government. And, it was a slow start. Longtime players like 3 of us will remember that time before CISA, before DHS even, where a lot of that U.S. cyber collaboration was being driven by Carnegie Mellon's Computer Emergency Response Center, their coordination center, CERT-CC. And as DHS came into being, CERT-CC was the backbone of that response, and U.S. CERT came into the world around 2003 to take on coordination and response. We started to see around then the beginning of information sharing and collaboration with the states. And New York State had a terrific CISO, their first fellow by the name of Will Pellegrin, who founded the multi-state CISA Act. And we started to see the very early days of information sharing and response at the state level. However, since that time, we've watched federal cyber capabilities explode in scope and depth. And states and municipalities have progressed at a much slower pace. The National Association of State CIOs, or NASCIO, and Deloitte published a biannual report, and they recognize that 45% of states don't have programs in place that enable information sharing between agencies, law enforcement, and the private sector. And only 53% of states have CISO roles even legislatively established and funded. Fortunately, all 50 states do have a CISO, but there's still more work to be done. At the city level, the National Council of Mayors, the trade association for mayors around the country, there is no information on cybersecurity. There was a technology committee established back in 2022, but I wasn't able to find any information there. And I raised that not at all as a slight. There are tremendous and important priorities and challenges that are facing cities today. And it's a really hard decision for elected officials to prioritize what matters. But I raise it because it's against this backdrop that we need to talk about this new shift that happened in March with the release of Executive Order 14239 entitled Achieving Efficiency Through State and Local Preparedness. And so there's a lot to unpack there. So Jeff, let's start with you. Can you help us sort of unpack this executive order and what it starts to mean for cybersecurity? Because I know there's a lot there.
Sure. Cristin, first, thanks for the chance to be here. Doug, it's great to be with you today. Cristin, as you mentioned, March 19th, this order was signed. It's actually not a particularly long order, but it does have some pretty significant changes. The bottom line up front, there are two significant policy shifts for disaster preparedness, response, and resilience. And I always want to hit the resilience point because I think we often leave the resilience piece out of disaster preparedness and response, and it is such an essential piece. But shift one is, and I'm quoting, federal policy must rightly recognize that preparedness is most effectively owned and managed at the state, local, and individual level. So right there, you have a shift from more federal lead to state and local, at least in word. And the second big shift is a call for the federal government to move from an all hazards approach to risk management to risk informed. And I think we're going to get into a little bit what that's going to mean specifically in the cyber context. Up front, the order does talk about cyber attacks in paragraph 1. So the breadth of it encompasses cybersecurity. I think we should not think about it myopically as cyber attacks. If you think back, it was about a year ago, the CrowdStrike incident that had a pretty significant effect at all levels of government and in the corporate world. Not an attack, but it still required preparedness, response, and resilience. The order itself also calls for a lot of stuff. Calls for a national resilience strategy, a national CI policy, critical infrastructure, a new continuity policy, some preparedness and response policies, and also a national risk register. Last point there. First, there have been various iterations of the national risk register. This will be an update. And all of these are not really truly new items. Some of them were underway when the transition happened, and I think they're being adjusted. Some are straight up redos. I think it's good to have these. These are coming in time. We're going to see them, but I'm always a little dubious of documents of strategies and demands that we create more strategies unless there's a really close tie to how that's going to affect operations on the ground and that they come with an implementation plan, because the governments at all levels have put out a number of strategies and other policy documents. And if they don't turn into action, they're really not worth that much. Top lines, again, though, are the big pieces, waiting to see how they will play out and what they will mean. I think we're going to see this across all types of disaster response, whether natural, cyber, or other. And I think, in summary, where I'm sitting, I don't think it's a leap to say that it's pretty likely the feds are going to be doing less and providing less. And so the states are going to have, I think, more responsibility, but not necessarily more authority, and almost certainly not more resources, certainly coming from the feds.
So that's a pretty big shift. Doug, how does this landing at the state level? You're in Snohomish County. Is this a conversation that's happening in Washington state? What are the state and large county CISOs like yourself doing at this point, or are you still in a wait and see space?
Well, first off, thank you for having me, Cristin. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's great. I don't think I'm worthy of just company, so thank you for inviting me along for the ride here. But basically, best way I can answer this question is let me tell you a story. I'll keep it short, but this is I think the most powerful way of really putting this a fine point on this. Because I have a small community in my county, and that small community a year ago had an issue where their firewall web interface was exposed, which is a major security problem. I had a call from CISA within a day or less saying, hey, there's somebody in your address space, because we're their ISP, who's got a web interface out there for their firewall. We should probably take care of that. And I thanked them for that. Went out, found out that they'd misconfigured their firewall. We got it straightened out, problem solved, no security issue there. Took care of it right away. 18 months later, just in the last several weeks, same city, same issue, different issue, but same city. But what happened is that we happened to be evaluating a vendor product, and we discovered that there was a exposed server on the web. that they misconfigured a firewall off the same community. Crickets from CISA or anyone else. If we hadn't have found it, that server would still be sitting out there exposed on the internet. That city, they do a good job. They try to do what they can. They have no formal security people on there that does things, and no one knows about that stuff. And so we now had to be in that fallback position for it. So you can see the contrast right there, just between last year and now. That's the reality on the ground that I'm now living with in terms of that sort of thing happening. We're putting in grant money for resources to help put in different things. There may be some vestiges of that left, but it's not clear that that's going to last, or there isn't actually that money. It's already been allocated there. And then as far as any future money goes, that's out the window. But we also, look at things like CJIS. That's the Criminal Justice Information System, which the FBI administers. Well, we got a mandate from them about, we want you to improve your security. So we've had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement security controls, which we got no money from the FBI for, which we had to do to implement to make that happen. And so I can see that happening in terms of the federal government and other things. What's going to happen is there's going to be, we need you to do X, Y, and Z to make sure you're protecting your critical infrastructure or these critical assets like criminal justice information. But, by the way, you're going to foot the bill for it to do it, and you're on your own as far as implementation strategies go. And so we've actually had problems where folks that were trying to do that upgrade didn't have the right expertise and did the wrong thing, and then wound up having to spend twice as much money. And so that's the sort of reality that I live in now, in terms of what this means when the rubber meets the road, at the pointy end of that stick, as it were.
Wow. So there's a lot that's interesting there. I think one of the things that jumps out to me too, Doug, is the fact that you have a city, not a town, but a city without security personnel. So the knock-on effect of that, you're in one of the 75th largest counties in the country by GDP. And so if you've got cities that don't have security personnel, how do you scale that if you're going to be taking on more security responsibility? What does that look like?
And it's worse because we actually have people having to make, cities having to make trade-offs about, okay, I had grant money before to pay for, human services. That money is now gone. So do I take that money and allocate that to make up the human services that I've lost versus investing more in cybersecurity? So we actually have seen some communities trying to balance their budget by letting IT people go, and as opposed to bringing them in. And that IT people that are left are working so hard at just doing availability, they have no time to upskill in terms of cybersecurity type things to take care of stuff. And, you think about somebody in my position, I came in with a lot of experience, so I'm an exception. But if I were the rule, you would have somebody in here who was doing this role that may or not have had the, that much of a background. And, my airport, happens to be a major contributor to a lot of the export economy of the U.S. because every big Boeing jet that's built flies out of my airport. So I get a little bit of critical infrastructure that I'm responsible for that matters. But I'm getting nothing to do that with other than what I get from my county as resources. There's, the federal government, I hope, would say something, but I'm not convinced that's the case anymore given recent experience.
So we know that there's a new national critical infrastructure policy coming in September, at least according to the executive order. Now, Jeff, what's your recommendation as we're in this gap space between now and when we start to see the policy? What would you be advising CISOs or those who are going to have to start to mind shift from the federal to the state? Yeah. How do we start preparing for that? What do you advise people to do?
So I think before you get to that shift, I would encourage Doug, your colleagues, and at corporate level too, not to accept that the shift is going to be complete or full. There is a program, I think Doug may have been referencing the state and local cyber grant program, which is up for reauthorization. It was a relative drop in the bucket, even though it was in the billions. But when you spread that across 50 states, and then 50 states have to allocate it down to municipalities, and some states had caps on it, if we're going to have this major shift of policy, we need to have resources going out to the state and locals. In theory, if the feds will be spending less on cybersecurity and other disaster preparedness, as much as I don't want to pay more in taxes, I don't want that money to go back to the Treasury. I want it to go around the country to help prepare. So I would encourage, while that program is up for reauthorization, reach out to your local members of Congress. I've worked on the Hill. They listen to constituent calls. If you can get a critical mass going, maybe we can get that reauthorized in a way that will help. But if I was at the state and local level, I would be updating my address book. When I was at CISA, when I was at the White House, one of my constant refrains when I went out and spoke was, even before that, when I did, straight up Katrina type disaster work I did early in my career, it is, the line back then, this is how old I am, is you don't want to be trading business cards at the scene of an incident. We're not really trading business cards anymore, but you want to have those contacts, you want to have those relationships. And we'd said, know who your local FBI field office is. More recently, know who your CISA cybersecurity advisor is. Know what other federal contacts you have locally. If you don't have it already, make sure you have that understanding at the state and local level too. Ask your state and local leadership, do they have a coordinator for cybersecurity? Who do you plug into if there's an incident? Understand what they may be expecting from you, because a lot of planning involves bringing in the private sector, whether at the federal, state, and local level. And at times, government is not great at communicating to the private sector what it is that they will be expecting in an incident. So make sure you have that set of understanding. But as always, view this through the lens of your own resilience. Understand what your core functions are, what you need to have running in a major incident, and have a plan in place to do that, almost assuming the worst, so that you are ready to react to a different range of scenarios. But now is the time to understand who your contacts in government are going to be if the federal involvement is shifting going forward.
No, I appreciate that. And but what we're getting, the feedback we're getting, so I'll give you another great example here. The federal government has cut the contracts for MSISAC. MSISAC lost the majority, quite a bit of their funding. And so now what you're telling us is, okay, MSISAC is going to a fee-based model. So now you're going to have to pay for that collaboration in a way which you've never done before. Now, larger counties and larger entities are going to be more resourced so they can afford it better than smaller entities are. But what they're telling us is, just use your grant money to pay your MSISAC dues. So in essence, what happened is what money we used to be able to spend for training or equipment is now going to go towards paying for just the basic collaboration stuff that used to be provided for free. And they used to provide, Albert sensors, which are an intrusion detection system, which actually provided a lot of intelligence to the federal government, are going to be for pay now. So who's going to keep those and who's not going to keep those? Because those are now, you have to pay for those. Same is true for, domain blocking stuff. So basic cybersecurity stuff that the federal government was paying for and getting a lot of benefit from, by the way, they're probably more than paying for themselves in terms of threat intelligence and early things that they were getting, and visibility are all going to go and disappear now. And grant money that was going towards, actual improvement is now just going to go to pay for basic collaboration. So it's sort of like we have a sewing bee that we're getting ready to get our muskets, to go out to be the militia to defend people, as opposed to being a modern army. And that's where we are. And that's the sense that I don't want to be, hopelessly downbeat. There's a lot of collaboration that happens. We have meetings once a month with every other major entity in the state. We've got lots of collaboration we're doing with the state and different things, but the state, and these other, even me, we're all federated. So we have a lot of cats we're herding independently of other things. So there's lots of agencies we're trying to herd, just like the federal government is within our state and local governments, because everything is federated at some level. So there's a lot of effort that's going into that. So there was a lot of sort of basic blocking and tackling that got done that's now gone. And I don't think people appreciate just what kind of gaps are starting to appear in that. And these are all things that you don't see, today, yesterday, but you'll see them in a few months when bad things start happening and there's no visibility to them.
Yeah, I want to double down on a few things Doug said, which I think are really important. Just because you as a citizen don't see the concrete results of the investment that the government is making does not mean that we are not getting benefits out of it every day. And these services cost money. And when the government pulls back funding, everyone is making really tough decisions. You're giving up. We are cutting to the bone in a lot of places now. The other point that Doug made, I think, which is really important, is the data that the federal government gets back that we're able to see across states, across localities, and use that to pick up on malicious activity that we otherwise would have missed is essential. It's true within the federal government. When I left CISA, we were collecting data from across federal agencies that was not available to CISA in the end of 2020 when we missed SolarWinds, one of the biggest intrusions out there. In retrospect, when we looked back at SolarWinds, there were indicators there that had we been able to correlate, we would have perhaps picked up on something, but we needed both more data and the ability to look across federal agencies. And we built that. And when I left, we were detecting significant, sophisticated nation-state intrusions that individual agencies, even with the most sophisticated tooling, was missing because there just wasn't enough data. But when you can look across a federated or enterprise, you can pick these things up, and then you can feed it back down. So that's the type of information that Doug was talking about. They may be getting pushed out. So there are real changes happening. And if we don't get our hands around stopping some of these soon, the consequences, some we'll see and some we'll never see, but they will be there.
Well, and I think that's a really important context, because the data that you collect is what enables you to go find that needle in the haystack. And, we've dialed the telemetry in to look for all threats and all hazards. That's been the aperture we've had for 25 years, is looking at wherever the threat may be coming from. All hazards is a pretty broad approach, but now we're shifting to what's being called a risk-informed approach. Jeff, I know you wrote about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think this means and what that means for state and local government.
Sure. I mean, and to be clear, I don't think that there is a right or a wrong here, but it is a shift. So all hazards, traditional disaster preparedness, you're preparing for a wide range of potential circumstances, building institutional capabilities that are useful irrespective of the type of disaster or incident you have. Some of these you're anticipating, some of them you're not. Contrast risk-informed means focusing on the specific scenarios that you deem most severe, most likely, and then concentrating your preparedness efforts on those specific things. Cybersecurity has always been a little different. Government and the private sector have decades of data, centuries of data on natural disasters and other incidents. Not only do we not have that in cybersecurity, it is fundamentally different. So identifying and ranking cyber risk is just harder because the probability and likelihood, both there's not the history and it depends on humans. There is an actual sentient bad guy out there, with the exception of the one-offs like CrowdStrike. But mostly there are bad guys out there who are changing their tactics, who are seeing how you prepare and are adjusting what they're going to do. In contrast, the hurricane is not going to say, oh, wait, look, Mississippi Gulf Coast was prepared, so I'm going to hit Pensacola this time. That's not how it works. So picking and choosing what you're going to prepare for, if it's too public, is just inviting someone to attack somewhere else. In terms of what it means for states and locals, the states will still need the feds. I talked on this a bit before. States do not, and I think unlikely will not ever collect foreign intelligence. So they're not going to be out there with collection activities or other, whether human or otherwise. They don't see across companies and regions the way that the federal government can because of the relationships. They don't have that aggregation of data I talked about before. The states and locals will also have to put time and money into racking and stacking which scenarios they want to prioritize if they're going to shift to this full-on risk-informed. I think what you're more likely to see is a hybrid approach, which again, I don't think is bad, but you need to have some general capabilities, but maybe pick out where you think is going to be the most significant. And to Doug's point, if you're having to cut back what you're going to do, it makes sense to figure out where you think you're most likely to get hit. But the worry is that if a state in the risk-informed model prioritizes the wrong risks, or if you're a less wealthy state that cannot prioritize as many risks, something's going to slip through, and ultimately it's your citizens that are going to be left holding the bag on that one.
So my assumption, of course, and maybe it's a naive one because I'm coming at this from the cyber perspective, is that when you are applying the all threats, all hazard approach, you're still applying a risk mindset to that. But
yes,
I've always brought that to the conversation. But from a cybersecurity perspective, Doug, I assume that you're already there. I mean, you already have to have that enterprise, if you will. You're a click down. You're already at the enterprise level of risk management, even though you're a government. So, is this a shift for you, or you're already there? What does it look like for you?
Well, I've had to always be very self-reliant myself. But what's been nice is that CISA has provided us some nice things like audits and other types of things that have been very helpful that we would not have been able to get otherwise. And so, see, that's now disappeared. And we also got, just advice. We meet up in informal social situations, and we would get advice from them about, here's what we're seeing. And that was super helpful to help us. You can't prioritize risk unless you have intelligence, because otherwise you're guessing. And so if you have no intelligence, then you're really adrift. And something else that I don't think everyone understands is that part of this equation, which is especially going back to the executive order, is that FEMA got gutted too. And so we've actually lost people in our emergency management system here. And so there's not, somebody waiting in the wings that's going to pick up cyber on top of, floods or earthquakes or everything else that they have to worry about. And they don't have the expertise, nor do they have the money to go out to acquire it. So you're assuming that you're going to, they keep talking about FEMA and emergency management people. Neither the people nor the money exists. So I'm not sure where that's coming from, in light of the order and how that's going to happen from that perspective. So, I'm having to do that role myself because there's no other place to do it that has the expertise or has the scope to do that. I could collaborate with them and make sure we're filling in the blanks as best we can. And they've certainly got resources in terms of when a bad thing happens, but in terms of preventing the bad thing, that's the other part of this is, you think about emergency management to Jeff's point, that's something that happens and you're now into the mode of trying to pick up after the fact. I've got to prevent it. So I got to stand there and keep the hurricane from hitting and also mitigating the after effects of if I mess up, preventing it from hitting. So I've got two sides to that equation that I'm fighting, not just the one side. So that's another big difference in cyber. Whereas you may have the Corps of Engineers, which is worrying about the preventative piece, when you have the emergency management people who are worrying about, okay, how do I pick up after the fact that the floods actually happened or whatever's going on. I'm both the Corps of Engineers and the emergency management people, both.
So that must put counties and states and major municipalities in the really hard position of having to decide, what do you stop doing? That's a hard challenge, because if your mindset is all threats and all hazards with a risk-informed mindset, if you're inverting that and it's risk-informed of the most likely outcomes, is it different, or are you still hitting the same things?
Well, you are, but there's an angle to this, is that you've got things like cyber insurance, which some people can afford, some people can't, some people can qualify, some people can't. So you got a have and have not situation going on in terms of how you insure against this. So you have a lot of entities out there who are operating without cyber insurance because they simply can't afford it, because they don't have all the controls in place that would give them a preferable rate as far as being able to be insurable. And so that's going on. And so, there's that piece of the puzzle which comes into it in terms of that's at least your fallback in terms of, being able to restore availability and get some kind of response process put together. But again, okay, do I worry about the earthquake, or do I worry about I'm going to have a ransomware attack, which is going to make me unavailable? There's some commonality there in terms of some things, in terms of communication, et cetera. So there's at least that part that's good, but the flip side of that is, how do I solve that? I don't think the scope of this is really, I don't think where folks understand really well. I could have wildly wrong statistics, but the cybercrime industry worldwide is like $10 trillion annually. And so I may be off, but not by much. And that's a huge chunk of the world's economy. Talk about efficiency. There's a place there to do that. So if I was going to put money in and talk about risk, there's a place to be worrying about that there, and worrying about cyber cartels are much worse than, in some ways, from an economic impact. I don't know. Certainly we want to save people's lives, but there are major issues here that I don't think we're getting the right kind of balancing in terms of resources and the types of things we're trying to do.
I think on the positive, looking for the silver lining, it does increase the emphasis on cyber at the state and local level. Like there's no bad in that. That's good. I do wonder, and Jeff, because you've worked a lot at the federal level, do you think that the states will on their own start to work together to harmonize some of these new plans and bring themselves together? Do we have to have a a good crisis before there is some of that organic organization? Or do you think that we'll just start to see states developing their own approaches based on what best suits them, and then the private sector adapts to wherever their principal places of business are, sort of like we have on the European side?
My gut is that as humans, we tend not to react to something until it has already become real. It's hard for us to prepare ahead of time. And what comes to my mind, my first job in government was the investigation after Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things we learned
That's where we met.
Yeah, way back when. The state of Louisiana, the city of New Orleans, actually had a remarkable evacuation of the general population. And the reason that worked well was I can't remember, it was maybe Hurricane Ivan a few years before, they had tried to evacuate and had a problem with cars backing up, and they came up with a system across the parishes and working with specifically Mississippi on how to get good traffic flow. They tried to work with Texas. At that point in time, Texas's, the lore was Texas had an attitude of, we're Texas, we have big roads. We don't have to worry about reversing the flow. And then Texas but the evacuation worked really well in New Orleans. Later that same year, it was a crazy year of hurricanes. Houston was about to get hit with a hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Rita, and had a disastrous evacuation. But thank God the hurricane turned, and Texas learned its lesson and really stepped up its ability to evacuate people through Houston and out. So when they had the more recent hurricanes, they were ready to do it. In those situations, thank God we had a real world test run that didn't run into cities being flooded. I worry that in the cyberspace, to your point of when are we going to do this, it's going to be after we have an incident. And one of the potential downsides of a shift to state and local leading in the cyberspace is a municipality preparing for some type of major outage may be assuming that they're going to get some capacity help from their regional partners. And if they haven't done good outreach, A, those regional partners won't expect it, but B, cyber incidents are not geographically bound the way a hurricane or a tornado or something else can be. So no one knows the breadth of how far it'll reach. If it is one of these significant ransomware attacks that Doug talks about, if it is localized to the municipality, yes, they will get help. But if it is a service provider to all municipalities that gets hit, then there's not going to be a lot of help coming from elsewhere. So my view is if the feds step back what they're going to do, one of the key places that they need to continue to have a role is to bring together states and municipalities to make sure that the planning is not siloed.
I think that's not only a really good point, I think it's something that CISA has done really well. I wonder if that gets harder for the national security side of that conversation with the FBI and the NSA. These are strong organizations from a cybersecurity perspective. But if the focal point for cyber is moving away from the federal government and more towards state and local, does that get disincented as well? Or do we just wait and see?
The FBI and CISA in particular have the on-the-ground relationships, or in some cases had the on-the-ground relationships with companies or with the localities. If that goes away, we're going to have that situation of we're going to have time delays of figuring out, does Doug know who he needs to talk to when there is an incident? Is the person that he has worked with at CISA or FBI, have they taken an early retirement package and they're gone? Or is that person now doing 4 jobs in the way that Doug is having to do multiple jobs? I don't know the answer to it. I think I'm worried when we find out it's going to be that people are pulled too far apart, and we're going to be reestablishing relationships that those agencies have spent the past decade developing.
Doug, could you unpack what cybersecurity is like at the major county level? What are your priorities? What is it like working with the state? What is life like for a CISO of a major county in the United States today?
It's like running a $1 billion enterprise, which is what it is, with the thousands of employees. Yeah, so there's all the same issues and challenges and everything else to go with running, just an enterprise at that level. And you have a veneer on top of that of law enforcement, courts. If you have a system go down, it isn't just that's inconvenient and maybe the business loses some revenue. People die. And so you got to think about making sure that stuff is highly available, and that's your priority. because, bad things happen if that stuff goes offline. And then you've got you're doing that with fewer resources. You're doing that with resources that are in many cases maybe not compensated as well. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for people coming out of CISA, is that, to Jen's credit, she did a good job of getting all those salaries raised to retain people at CISA. Problem is, they're all coming out expecting those salaries. And if they're not going to stay in government, I can tell you right now, there's no place in government for folks at the salaries that CISA was paying people. And they're going to have to either take a haircut if they're going to stay in government, or they're going to go somewhere else. And so all that expertise that was in government is going away when it leaves CISA. And it's just because, and that's something that people are talking about as well, is that there was because of that shift. And I think it was the right thing to do. I'm not arguing that that's not the case, but what that did was it created a real step, which makes it difficult now for those folks to stay in any kind of governmental function, because they're not going to be able to do that. And, except for, again, it's going to be a have and have not situation. You're not going to imagine a CISA person going to work for a small community or a city or anything else, because they're not going to pay anywhere near what they got at the, at the CISA level. They're going to have to go to private industry for the most part, or very well financed sort of, or, communities. And so, and then the other thing so there's a lot, so that's part of it. The other thing is I've got a lot of mandates that I have to deal with, like, criminal justice information system, critical infrastructure that we have to work with, things like that. And then I've got to build, I'm now the resource that, the people contact that are in my geography. So like these cities and things that have issues, I have one city where the chief of the IT person, who's the CIO, is the finance manager. And he's protecting a water system and a sewer system. And so he's going to know about how to, if his firewall is up to date with, everything that's there, and he's depending on vendors to do that. Well, the vendor, turns out, wasn't. And so he doesn't know that. And it was only, somebody like CISA that really was paying attention to something like that, but they aren't. So now is it incumbent on me now to try to do that? That's where that's where some of that's coming out of this, that now I'm having to worry about those sorts of things because they aren't. It's not a theoretical issue. I have seen it in action, as I said before, and then referenced that one city. So these are real world problems that are happening right now where there's this gap. And then the other thing about it is that people we haven't talked about at the federal level, and this across all agencies, people aren't doing anything that doesn't just hoe to a very narrow mandate. Everyone's got their head down. Everyone's worried about what's going on. And so if there's anything that even smacks of getting outside of their lane, they're not doing it. And so there's a lot of things that people used to do that would be maybe, nice, but maybe not quite in their lane. All that's gone. So I call it the goodwill factor. There was a goodwill factor that used to exist, just evaporated, and it's just gone now. And so, people take an interest, and they'll say, well, if you have a problem, call me. But there's nothing proactive that's going on that I can see from a federal government perspective. And the states are all, as I say, trying to deal with their own budget problems, their own issues at the enterprise level. And so there is some activity happening to try to coordinate it, make it go. But now that you've got EISAC that's gone, so you have elections that you're trying to run, no support from EISAC. So there's probably no war room for any things, in terms of sharing threat intelligence and anything else, because that's all gone. MISAC, you may get some participation since they made it a graduated scale for fees, but there's going to be people who drop out. And so there's going to be some opportunity to share. Maybe we'll lean on them more than we have in the past to try to coordinate. But there's not anybody out there that's trying to drum up stuff. We're having to resort to, there's a whole new volunteer effort going on, but it's a response. They're trying to stand up a whole separate Washington State, volunteer incident response organization to try to backfill this whole issue. And that's great. They'll get people from industry and everywhere else, and they'll make a good run at it. But that's kind of a sad statement of where cyber fits in the scheme of things, that we're having to have a volunteer fire department to take care of, stuff that kind of matters at, on basic economic and other level. And that's where we are. We're in essence, setting up volunteer fire departments.
That's quite a thought. So with the volunteer fire department, talk about how they're going to help us combat foreign cyber threats like
They're an instant response team. A fire happens, and then they can come and offer help, and have folks that are are accredited in some form to know something about cybersecurity who can come to your assistance for free. But that's in essence what it is. Some people show up with hoses to help you put out the fire.
Isn't this, and Jeff, you might remember better than I because my legislative brain has faded over time. Wasn't this, there was like a cyber core that Ron Wyden had talked about years and years ago legislatively, just like an InfraGard-like force that could come in and provide support at the state and local level. Am I misremembering that?
No, there have been a couple of different proposals. I think Congressman Langevin may have had something like that. Senator Gillibrand, I think, had something like that. Nothing yet like that has passed into law. There have been studies. The NSTAC, the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee of the President has looked at private sector mobilization to support cyber, but there's no coordinated effort or structure around it at the federal level that I'm aware of. One of the things that different places I was where we looked at that we ran into is the concern of double counting. So if the National Guard is expecting, like Maryland in the Columbia area, not surprisingly, has a lot of cybersecurity expertise, some of whom are reservists in some of the cyber units. If they get called up, great. Now we have more capacity in the military, but most of them are doing cyber for their day job. So you have to be really careful about when you pull someone in to do something, what are you actually pulling them from? There have been a lot of efforts, nothing that has come to fruition. I suspect it's something we'll keep hearing about, but Doug hit on a key point, which is accrediting those people to make sure they can come in and actually know how to help you and what they can do. And we shouldn't be in the place where we're looking for a volunteer fire corps in the aftermath of a major incident, because if it's really that big, we're going to have everyone across the region is going to be looking for that help, and prioritizing is going to be almost impossible.
And if we get it wrong, we've opened ourselves up to a data breach because we've then exposed ourselves to people looking at data belonging to either our customers, our employees in an unauthorized way. And so you could, by attempting to help protect customers, violate the very premise upon which you're trying to protect them. So yeah, that's a thorny thought, and sounds more like a law school hypothetical than an actual solution at this point. So
the other piece of this is, sorry to interrupt you, but the other piece of this, what we didn't talk about, was that there is the private piece of this. There's a lot of us are having to basically hire our own private fire departments like they used to do in London in the old days. They had either your volunteer fire department or you had a fire plaque, which said you paid for somebody to come put the fire out. And that's what a lot of us ended up doing. But then you get back to the point of, now you have these private institutions that are now looking over your shoulder at sensitive data. I try to compartmentalize it and everything else, but maybe others are not as good at that as others. And so there's a whole, and resources go into that maybe could be going into something else. So there's a whole private industry that has now sprung up that is backfilling some of this that people are just, in essence, paying for. And you take a look at how this has happened in law enforcement. You look at something like Flock or somebody like that, is in essence what they've done is, because there's no expertise in law enforcement, they basically have privatized the license plate cameras, and they're providing that expertise into law enforcement. And they've outsourced that, but it's creating issues of privacy and other things to go along with that. And so those are sorts of issues that you're going to run up against, because if you're not going to get it at a public level or a community level, then you're going to get it at a private level. And then if you were private, then all these law school issues and liability and data privacy and stuff all start to rear their head. So this is not, there's just so many multiple points where this can come up and be problematic that I don't think it's really nearly as appreciated as it should be.
So as you look at resources that are available to a CISO at the county and the state level today, as you're preparing and responding to cybersecurity incidents, what's missing? Like, what do you wish you had that you don't have today at your disposal?
What I wish I don't miss something I don't know I should be missing. And that's the biggest worry I have. Is I used to have, to the point of making that at the very beginning with that example, I had gotten that phone call. Hey, you have something going on. I didn't get that phone call for something else. So now what that says to me is no one's watching. So now I have to assume that there's no facility out there that's providing me any kind of proactive support, then I have to do it all myself. And so I have to allocate resources and spend money and spend time to do that. And that may be not true. There may be things that are going on, but I have no visibility at that at this stage. I do go to meetings all the time. I, attend, and so there's some intelligence sharing that goes on, but it's, telling me about North Korean remote workers. Well, that's important. I think that's an important issue, but that doesn't solve the fact that, there's other, I think, more important, riskier things that don't get talked about. And so are you also talking to my suppliers? Because, I'm highly dependent on if the fact that Microsoft is actually on the ball. And, and I know how the sausage is made. And I think that they are in some ways and they aren't in others, given the attrition and some of the, priorities that are happening there right now. There's a lot of lip service, but we'll see where the rubber meets the road and some of those things. So, that's the other part of it, is that there's a whole private industry out there, which, is responding to this in varying degrees. And at least before, there was a little bit of a federal government prodding to do a better job through, secure design and things, that it's not clear that I think they've tried to keep that alive. I know that S-bombs, I think, survived some of this, but there's not near the emphasis that there once was.
Although on the flip side, our friends on the privacy side of the equation have never had the central support and coordination that we have. They've always lived in the states first model. And so it makes me wonder, as we watch the privacy community come more and more into cybersecurity, if we should be preparing for this model with certain states becoming the super leaders for others, like the California Privacy Act and how CCPA is a bellwether for the United States, and how we're seeing Texas leading some fines in data privacy and data protection enforcement that are on par with the size of fines we're seeing in the EU. So, do we anticipate, or should we think about certain states becoming super leaders on security in the same way that we've seen states move out on privacy?
So I think the way you've described it is what I think is the glass is half full, where we're going to have some states that really are going to set the bar high and show what is capable to manage cybersecurity at the state level. The flip of it is there are going to be haves and have-nots. Some of the states that are less well-financed, less tax revenue, are not going to be able to do as much. And they're the ones who rely on the types of scans that Doug has talked about, the general scanning that CISA would do, the alerting. And I think you will have some states that, even if they aspire to do what California or New York could do, won't be able to finance it. The other piece on the approach to privacy, that's a statutory regulatory framework. And again, you may have states that are putting those standards in place, but I don't think that it will drive it from an actual state preparedness. Where it could help, Cristin, I think that's a good point, is if California, New York, Texas were to get together and have similar secure by design requirements, that will drive industry, because company is not going to build one version of a product to sell securely in New York, Texas, California, and that they will then sell insecurely in Florida, Idaho, and North Dakota. So that's where you may get some help. Doug, my understanding is that the secure by design push, maybe not by that name, is going to continue. I've heard some really good talk from some of the incoming folks that they want to even put some more teeth on it, because they recognize that the long-term fix for so many of these problems is better products and not just hardware. We have problems with edge devices, routers, et cetera. Improving those devices to the point where our adversaries do not know them better than us is one of the foundational things we need to do to improve our overall security. We need to make it harder for whether it's a criminal or a nation state.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And as I said, I think that there is, at least that's one area that's a little bit of a bright spot in the administration, that they have continued on that front. But, but just again, practical, knowledge on the ground. As far as I know, I'm the only public sector CISO that I'm aware of in Washington State that's requiring my vendors to provide me an SBOM. And that's fighting tooth and nail.
Yeah.
And that's probably only because I helped write some of those regulations for the cloud with CISA. So, I'm weird in that sense that I'm a real outlier there, but that's the sort of issue you talk to folks, and most of the folks, my peers, and that isn't even on the radar, but they may have some knowledge about SBOM, but they're not even thinking in terms of what that would mean from a vendor relationship standpoint, where that goes. And so I try to bring it up every chance I get, that's a tangible thing you can do now that will give you at least some indicator of cyber awareness for the vendor you want to do business with, independent of a Secure by Design pledge, because everyone will tell you, I built my product the best on the planet. Where the reality is without an independent way of verifying that. I mean, we don't have the underwriting laboratory for software. And that's been a big issue for a long time from a liability perspective. And it gets involved in other practical stuff that we could talk about for a very long time. And we'd love to, I'm sure. But the issue I'm up against is that I need a way to judge somebody. And SBOM is the only way, a credible way right now I can do that, outside of if I start digging into the process and they actually can publish and give me, what their Secure by Design principles. But, even Microsoft has retreated from some parts of the SDL, which is very scary to me, which is and disappointing. So
I think it's a really interesting example to use SBOM, and because it is a low-hanging fruit, you would think, that everybody can ask for, and we know what it is. But I agree with you, Doug. It's not something that I'm hearing my clients, or I'm not seeing colleagues ask for. And so I worry a little bit about the fact that it's a tool that could be used, but isn't being. That gets even harder when we get into AI deployments. I wonder what our cybersecurity changes look like for our global coordination. Over the past decade, you've seen 15, 20 years, really, the United States has invested so heavily in cybersecurity collaboration and coordination, and has really lifted up a lot of its global partners. I think that the US UK collaboration with the UK NCSC is phenomenal. I think that the work that they do is amazing. I think when we see the advisories that come out from CISA, UK NCSC, the Canadian Cybersecurity Center, the Australian Cybersecurity Center, these add so much heft. One of the things that's always been impressive to me about the United States is that it has invested in global coordination over the past 10 or 15 years, and we've really seen a benefit from that. I mean, it's been a rising tide. And I think when you see the US issue a joint advisory with its partners from the Canadian Cybersecurity Center, from the UK NCSC, the Australian Cybersecurity Center, and others that may join in that slipstream, it has tremendous impact. I think that's outstanding. How does that shift, or does that start to shift, if we start to have a more state-oriented approach? Do we have super states that, with Texas and California and New York and maybe Florida start to look to establish some of their own partners to trade threat intel? Do they start to issue advisories? Well, does the multi-state CISA Act take on a different role here? What does this mean for global coordination? Any thoughts on that?
I'll let Jeff answer this one for the most part. I'll just give you one example. I get more information from my prior life at Microsoft and talking to the UK and Australia and other friends in Europe than I get from CISA now. So, FYI.
I'm talking aspirationally now. My hope is that the international relationships are still managed through CISA, FBI, NSA, and stay strong. It is, Cristin, you're absolutely right. The quality and strength of those relationships is remarkable, and the benefit that all the nations get from them. And I think the federal government had gotten very good at passing down information very quickly. The line I used in my time at CISA was, the days of if only are largely behind us. What we used to hear was, if only the government would declassify, if only the government would push out information, we'd all be better, as if there was some trove of specific intel that the government was sitting on. I don't know that that was ever true, but just in the 4 years from what I saw at the beginning of 2021 through early 2024, the pace and quality of the information that we pushed out, and the Ukraine war, do not discount the impact that had on the way that the community approach declassifying and using information, and that bled into the cyberspace. Rob Joyce, a star at NSA, who really focused on getting things out. It was tremendous, and it has benefited all of us. It's hard for me to see how that could work well. I mean, it could work for an individual state, and maybe they could push it back out, but you're going to have such an information overload if you have the type of foreign partnerships feeding information through multiple sources and then having it go back out. It could be just this horrific game of telephone and not knowing what to trust. And you talked about the importance of the seals, and that's one of the things I talked about a lot in many past lives. When advisory came out, I always looked to see what agencies and what nations had sealed it. In the US, when you saw NSA, FBI, CISA across the top, to me, that was an indicator that there's pretty good consistency. When we were bringing in the NCSC and the Australian Signals Directorate and Canada and New Zealand as well, it really sent a statement of the quality of the information. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be watching going forward, how the sealing works. And CISA, SEAL, not CEIL, the rigor that CISA put into making sure that cybersecurity advisory we thought was worthy of our seal and developing that brand around, number one, this is something new and novel that people need to hear about. We don't want to cause alert fatigue. And number two, we're actually giving people something actionable. That was, I went through some pretty rough meetings talking about whether we were going to sign on to things or not, where the team was very focused on we are making sure that when we put our seal on something, it matters. And that has built those relationships with the foreign partners. And I think that would be very hard to recreate at the state level, and we shouldn't have to, frankly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as an institutionalist and somebody that believes in CISA and the mission, and I think it's going to endure. And I still think we'll see advisories, and I remain ever the optimist. I'm curious, as we think about how a supply chain attack might hit, if we do see another SolarWinds or, the next type of attack that comes in, or maybe we can pick on the attack that's hitting right now, the Citrix Bleed 2. It's a couple of weeks, 2 weeks into the attack. It was the vulnerabilities were disclosed June 24th. We're recording this on July 8th. As of at least couple hours ago, there was no announcement on either the UK or the US government websites about the attack activity. So it's only been on the private sector side. There's evidence of attacks in the wild. What would states do if you started to see massive exploitation, a la the Hafnium attack from a few years ago? My gut tells me that the federal government would still get involved, regardless of what we're hearing about the shift to the states. I still think we would see the federal government get involved. But assume, for the point of discussion, that we have a major Hafnium-like attack and it's hitting all over the states. How would Washington State be collaborating with you, Doug? I mean, and Microsoft is here. So what would that be looking like? What do you hypothesize that experience might be like?
Well, there was an attack that happened at the Port of Seattle last year, and I've talked to the CISO there about what his experience was. And he had a lot of, CISA came in very quickly and was there collaborating with him. He had help from the state was very interested, but wasn't deeply involved. But what happened is that while they were involved and they provided some help, what's kind of odd is because we all have to go out and get cyber insurance. Cyber insurance now it sort of takes the lead. And so what happens is that the information doesn't get shared. All of us were interested because I have an airport. I want to know what's going on with the Port of Seattle. I can't get told that because the liability lawyers at the cyber insurance company say you cannot share that information. So you have an active attack that's going on that you can't get any information on because it's embargoed because of the lawyers that are associated with that particular issue. And it's not that they don't want to or don't feel like it's important information, but they're embargoed from doing it. Now it's true for the Seattle Public Library attack too. They couldn't talk about it for ages, about what actually went on there. And so it eventually comes out, but it comes out, late. And so you're sitting there saying, well, am I going to be next? But want to be next for what? You don't know. And that's a big problem. And in the past, we gotten at least some sense from the government that they could, they could watch out for stuff without revealing stuff. They were sort of a neutral third party who could pierce that sort of liability veil. But that's not true anymore. I mean, they're not there in that same role and the same way that they were. And so I'm not convinced that we would have any intel to know what actually happened because of this, that what's going on. That's another element that I hadn't seen before, which I think is important, not getting discussed, is that when bad things happen, there's actually a real embargo on information and information sharing until after the fact. And so when you're operating in real time, you're in the dark.
That's a really interesting point because I don't agree. And I don't agree because I think it's a cultural problem. When we first started watching ransomware hitting at the states and the municipalities, nothing was said back then too. I think that's cultural because when you see major attacks hitting in the private sector, the tech companies tend to lean into it and talk about it. So what liability is different there than for the victim? Obviously, we can talk ad nauseum about the nuances of liability and where it sits. But
I'm just, this is just reality. I don't know. I don't know.
You. The point that I'm pushing on here, Doug, is that I think too often people are waving hands saying liability can't share. And it is not actually the answer. And I share your frustration. And so that embargo hurts more than it helps.
Cristin, can I make a pitch for another legislative, also called the CISA Act? CISA 2015 was an information sharing act. And full disclosure, when I worked at a private cybersecurity company then, I was not in love with that bill, but having seen how it works on the inside, it addresses some of the things that make it hard for organizations to share. They're worried about regulatory liability. They're worried about legal liability. CISA has the ability, if this is reauthorized, to come in and say, share with us this threat information. It cannot be used for any regulatory purpose. We can then anonymize it and share it back out as Doug was talking. Organizations even share with the FBI, even though they don't have that protection, even though it's a law enforcement agency. That's a place where the government can take the information in and anonymize it or share it out in a way. And again, our focus at CISA was, are we providing, we were the only agency that was team defense. All CISA did was defense. Our focus was, are we giving somebody something practical that they can use today? Because if they're not going to be able to improve their security, do we want to spin them up today or wait until we can actually give them something that will help to spin them up? So what's happening with the Citrix vulnerability? It's interesting to me that both the NCSC and CISA haven't acted. It suggests to me that there is something going on. Both of those agencies, in my experience, will move very quickly. NCSC is phenomenal in what they can put out. But yeah, this is where the private sector is having to lead now. And worry it is a lot of what Doug was talking about, is the loss of people and capacity, and things aren't happening as quickly as they used to.
Well, it also brings up really interesting new entrants into these conversations. Like, will we see more active state attorneys general? Will we see more state police get involved in some of these conversations? I think time will tell. And, if we have volunteer forces coming together, National Guard, I think those models are going to vary state to state. And that's going to be really challenging for cyber responders, because in addition to the cyber responders having to know now the nuances of, I've got 6 hours for an incident notification in India and 2 hours if I'm doing something special in Singapore and 12 hours or sooner if practicable in Australia. Now I got to remember it's the state AG and the state police in Alaska, but it's these guys in Mississippi. We're adding complexity in a hyper compressed time frame. It's going to get a lot harder for responders to manage.
Very.
So, considering the scarcity of resources, Doug, how do you manage the accountability challenge? Because it feels like all roads lead to Rome, and that's the CISO. And so how do you manage, or how are you working through the challenges of responsibility and accountability and, CISO insurance and liability protection for yourself when this is all ending up in your inbox?
Well, it's does the sleepless nights count? The fact that I'm actually, I actually started in cybersecurity when I was 10 years old. No, it's what it comes down to is that there is, I have got, you do take D&O seriously, and you do make sure that you have insurance against that, and you have some backdrop there. What you really depend on is strong folks in your sort of your command chain that you educate about. Here are the issues that I'm facing. Here's the risks that we have. I can do X, but suddenly we got this big gap. In fact, that's a conversation I'm having right now. We have this big gap that's opened up, and now we've got to try to fill that gap as best we can. And the conversation for a long time for savvy CISOs has been basically not if you're going to get hit, but when. And now the conversation is not just when, it's going to be how bad. Because at least before you had some way of talking about resilience and recovery and things like that. But if there's a resource shift, then that's just whatever I can do, in terms of the limits of my cyber insurance or the limits of whatever I can get in terms of local resources to recover. But there's no, before at least there was a sense of there were some folks that had my back. And that seems to be gone now. And again, that's perception. Reality, may be very different. I can imagine that, I have a good relationship with the FBI, I have a good relationship with CISA, things like that. I mean, they could, I'm an important, entity in the state as opposed to smaller entities. So maybe they'll pay, more attention and provide resources that I, when the time comes. So I haven't tested that. So there could be more to it than, more people may have my back than I'm aware of. But I'm not feeling the warm fuzzies either. That the way I did, it's just so interesting that there's a stark contrast between a year ago and now. That I can just see all of these. I can give you example after example, but all of these things that have just changed. That put this in a whole different climate.
So, if you could build the state system that you want, what would that look like? What would the most important pillars be, and how would it be different from what you've got today?
Well, what I'd like to see is that I think we have a model for this, and the model is something along the lines of the National Guard. I think we need something along that where we have, sort of citizen cyber soldiers, if you will, that work in industry or work in government that get called up and respond to a natural disaster, just like we do for natural disasters. We have a model for how this works, and they go out and they do recovery. They can guarantee availability. They have your back. They're managed at a state level. They've got state resources, their federal equipment and backup and stuff that comes with it. And I think that there is a model there that maybe I get that there's a military aspect to it, which puts a nuance on it, and they get called up for, going to battle somewhere overseas and things like that. But if we could take the purest, form of the National Guard and use that as a state model, there's some merit and analogies there in terms of the sorts of things that they do and sorts of things that we need. And having, as I say, citizen soldiers, but folks that are, deep in the trenches of security or work at Microsoft or, other vendors and have, or understand the code, understand this stuff that you can mobilize when there's a major emergency would be, amazing.
So in that vein, if you've got citizen soldiers that can help mobilize, do you also need a well of threat intel that's consistently available to either them or to you that doesn't exist today? Because I imagine with the loss of Albert, or at least the changing of that model, that availability of threat intel is shifting and it's expensive. So
Right.
What does that look like?
Well, I mean, that's the other piece of it. To torture my analogy some more, that's like the Weather Service. The Weather Service is telling it the hurricane is forming, and it's offshore, and it's going to hit, in a few days, and that's what the threat intel is that's the Weather Service. And so I need a Weather Service too to be able to do that. And so I can either have my own Weather Service or I can buy a private Weather Service. But or the government does it, which is something else that's evaporating off the landscape now. So, I mean, that's an important element of this, is having that ability to know and predict and see, and then you can mobilize on the basis of that and be able to do something with it. But yeah, I guess it's all a question of resources and reallocate. But I'm having to do a lot of things that I used to be able to get either at very low cost or free before, which is intrusion detection systems, domain blocking, threat intelligence. I used to have if I don't join or pay for MSISAC, I had a SOC in MSISAC. If I'm a smaller entity, like a small city, that was my SOC. That was somebody I could phone up and talk to who had a cybersecurity expert there. If I don't pay the fee, I don't have that anymore. So it's turned into a private model now, whereas before it was free that I could sign up and get that information, get that from. So it's changed dramatically.
Oof, that's a lot of change. Now, if you were to assess your county, do you have, of course, you're a CISO, so you have KPIs, but do you have KPIs that are consistent at the state level? Like, how do you know how Snohomish County is comparing to Washington State? Or do you, as state and public-facing CISOs, do you share your metrics with each other?
We share a lot of information amongst ourselves, but the way I've done is I have to spend a lot of my resources on audits. Before I could get those for free, but I spend a lot of my resources in audits to make sure that I haven't missed anything, and I get them from different vendors, whereas before, and the state does, to their credit, have the ability to do audits. You have to wait in line for it, but they are doing it for smaller entities and stuff. So that's something Washington State's doing that I applaud. It's coming out of the state auditor's office. They actually are doing cyber audits for free for different entities. It's not, you have to wait, years to get somebody to come do it, but they will do it. And that's how the smaller institutions like that one city I described, can actually get, good cybersecurity folks to come in and do that for them. And so that's a capability that exists out there. But that's the only way you can really, you can talk about KPIs and things that you're trying to do and everything else. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, okay, where's rubber meet the road? Do you have it? Do you have these controls in place? Have they been verified? Are they audited? Do you know about them? Things like that. And that's what I insist on is I want to make sure that it's all there and real as opposed to, just a metric on a chart.
Now, the last question I'll ask you, Doug, about the state and local space is, do you have a percentage or how much of your infrastructure is migrated to the cloud?
Actually, it's hybrid. And I think most people are like this. We've all discovered that storage in the cloud is problematic from both a cost and a privacy point of view. And so typically what's happened is, you're silly to do email yourself. So people have outsourced their email out. Some of the things that they do, but they also, to the flip side, are keeping storage local. So I think most entities are doing a hybrid model. I know very few that are completely in the cloud, and I know very few that are completely, everything done locally. Most folks, have taken, and I think that's true of industry too. I think more and more folks have discovered that there's economically and for certain regulatory purposes, you're better off to keep some things local and some things in the cloud, and that's where it's gone. And I think that's the model. We're not that much different than industry in that regard.
Well, that's good to hear. So, Jeff, as the longtime federal expert here, the thing that strikes me about listening to Doug is that the cost of providing support at the state level and then trickling it down to the counties and major municipalities, that's a decade of deliberate federal funding and migration, and then moving money up from state budgeting processes into practicality before we see real gains. Does that track? Like, what is showing up for you as you're hearing this from a federal to state support and finance perspective?
So from the intel perspective, there's economies of scale for the feds to aggregate a large volume of the threat intel specific, whether it is actual cyber threat intel or general threat actor intent, or if it is knowledge of what ransomware actors are doing. One transition that has been happening independent of other government transitions is so much of the really good threat intel is owned and managed by the private sector right now. There was a push for automated indicator sharing, federal mandate that CISA push out a large volume of data. CISA has tried to shift to quality over quantity because so much of that is now commercially available and it's a better use of federal resources. And that may be what some of the states and locals, but the CISA Act obviously played a role in sharing a lot of that out that Doug is now having to pay for. But to me, where the feds For this to work the best and to make the best use of our resources, the feds need to continue to provide Overwatch in at least two ways. One is on the threat piece. The other is the type of scanning that Doug talked about. The vulnerability management subdivision in CISA is an unspoken, unknown hero for the work that they've done with Doug and others in companies and small entities to go out there and alert them to. You have when I was in the private sector, I got a call from someone who had a CISA cybersecurity advisor who got my number because someone at CISA had scanned and seen that the organization I was in was using a vulnerable device. We got that just as Doug talked about the misconfiguration they talked about. So that's two areas of Overwatch the feds should be. Another thing the feds can do really well is help prioritize what we should be focusing on now. But the resource allocation piece, the state and local cyber grant program is essential because the realities on the ground for state and locals, I think, in my experience, Doug, tell me if I'm wrong, you'll rarely have your citizens demanding, we want better firewalls, we want protected DNS. They're going to be asking for firefighters and things like that. So if you have a dedicated resource that will help, I hate rising tide lifts all boats, or the other analogy is, your county doesn't have to, you're being chased by a bear, your county doesn't have to be faster than the bear. It just has to be faster than the next county. So getting the resources out so we get that baseline up there, that's the thing the feds can help identify what they are and push them out. And I think we're in this period of accelerated change of both resources and human power. And I'm hopeful we get new leadership in CISA soon that will stabilize that mission. But I understand a number of reasons why Doug's probably losing sleep right now, besides being a CISO in this world today.
So last question, Doug, pulling on the thread that we just heard from Jeff, if we've got a new CISA head or we've got a new leader coming in, what would you ask for from the state and county perspective? What's the most important priority for you?
It's hard to say because it's multifaceted. I mean, where do you start to draw the line about it? To Jeff's point, the vulnerability piece, which I talked about with the example from the city, is important. The fact that they're putting out these vulnerability, all the patching advisories and the CVEs and stuff, that's critically important, which, that was an open question for a little bit there until they got the contract sorted out. So there's that whole issue of just doing the basics around vulnerability management. Where do they take the leadership in terms of secure design and SBOMs? And then, the more practical things like Albert, and doing intrusion detection and domain blocking and things like that, where they can be, practical. I mean, if you think I'm in bad shape, I'm in really good shape. I have resources. I'm in a large county that has some funds to go do things. I really feel for the folks that are in, these tiny counties that just have virtually no money. They are folks that are charged for running IT that don't have, that have not, they're not specialized. They're trying to do every job under the hat, under the sun, including, CIO, CISO, and everything else that goes with that. And they're the ones that have been even more heavily assessed than I do, because that's their only body of expertise that they have regular interactions with. And at least in Washington State, we've got an organization of cities and counties where we can get together and talk and try to support each other and provide information and give that ability to sort of, be a resource for folks through email or through chat or through on the phone or whatever to try to help folks. But they're the ones that I feel that where I'd love to do is get, one of these tiny counties out here and get them on with you. And then you would really hear where the rubber meets the road, because they're the folks that are true. They don't have as much critical infrastructure as I'm managing, but the flip side is that there's important stuff that they're doing. Elections being high on that list, which we haven't talked much about. I put the CISA Act on, and that's where that really meets the road, and that's where all those CISA was their CISO, and that's now gone. And so that's the thing that I'm worried about. And I think CISA is trying to step in a little bit in that role, but they're doing that without funding, and so these counties now are having to pony up to pay for that as a service. And so do they have, where are they going to, the good thing is, as I say, it's a tiered model, but, there's still money at the door they're going to have to use. So I'm probably being elliptical on your question here, but I think that I'm just trying to point out that this is a multifaceted problem. There was a lot of things they did, but my situation is not nearly as dire as I think, as if you were to talk to some folks that are in much smaller entities, what their situation is.
I think CISA as the CISO for small counties and towns is a really great thing to think about and a really great takeaway for people to remember that for small towns. I have an adopted small town where I went in to meet with the town manager just to talk to him about cybersecurity and going to the cloud. And he said, I don't have time to go to the cloud because I don't have time to scan everything. And because he was the town manager, the staffer as well. And he had every property document going back into the 1980s surrounding him. And it was all of the records of the town. And he had a warehouse full of documents, but he was the CISO, the CIO, the CTO, the water manager, he was the town manager. And so I really feel for the fact that that is replicated in thousands of towns and villages all across the country. That's a terrific point. Jeff, any concluding thoughts as we wrap this up?
To your question about what would my message be to the incoming leadership, it's simple. It is go out to the CISA workforce and tell them how valuable they are and how important they are and their mission is, because I think there are a lot of really good people who are a bit confused and demoralized, and there's good leadership on tap, I think, and hopefully we'll land soon, but go straight to the people because the mission will follow from the people.
For sure. Absolutely. That's a great way to end it right there. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Advancing Cyber. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and that we've advanced cyber along the way. I want to thank our guests, Jeff Greene and Doug Cavit, and our Advancing Cyber team, our sound engineer, Louis Pialago, and our research interns, Nadia Amrani and Yash Dutt. You can share your ideas and recommendations via email at cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Cristin Flynn Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.